is Heber J. Grant, 7th President of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints.
That these fertile valleys of the Rockies are a tribute to the industry, sacrifice, thrift, and courage of the pioneer men and women who founded this land of bountiful beauty. For the strength of the hills, we bless thee, our God, our Father's God.
It's such a sad story. A lot of times I've had to tell this when I was younger and I could remember more things.
On January 29, 1863, 250 men, women, and children were massacred at Bear River, near the border of Utah and Idaho.
The question of whether the slaughter that happened in January 1863 on Bear River, whether it was a massacre or a battle, goes back long ways. But of course, the standard definition of massacre in the American West is that Indians did it. If 2 people are killed, it's a massacre, as long as they're whites being killed by Indians.
My grandpa's grandmother, she went around to see if she could recognize anyone, and she said their faces were battered and some of them heads were chopped off, and so she couldn't tell who was killed.
It was a despicable massacre because it didn't have to happen. The officers knew that they were not to target women and children, but they let it happen anyway.
Roughly 200 California volunteers, led by Colonel Connor of the U.S. Army and supported by area Mormon settlers, devastated the Northwestern Band of Shoshone camp. Once the Indians were cleared from Cache Valley, the Mormon settlers would plan on using the land for their farms and cattle. It was the single largest Indian massacre in American history.
The Great Temple is a remarkable example of pioneer architecture. 4 days after his arrival in the desert wilderness, Brigham Young, while walking, suddenly stopped and, striking his cane into the parched soil, said, "Here we will build the temple of our God."
One thing that's fascinating, if you look at Mormon Indian doctrines, is that they've been pretty successful among Native peoples. I've met many Western American Indians who proudly identify themselves as Mormons.
After the massacre, the remaining Shoshones converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in order to survive. Years later, they were given a plot of land called Washakie Farm on which to live. They built modest homes and formed a small but close community. This land was leased to the Indians by the Mormons. However, by the 1960s, few remained at the farm because many had left to fight in the Second World War, and others were job hunting or visiting relatives.
And the church, not totally understanding the culture of the Indians, decided that they could no longer had any reason to keep the farm up there, so they sold it. And in doing so, they had to clear the land, and they burned all of the homes that were there.
The LDS Church took the opportunity to burn all of the homes to the ground and claimed ownership of the land once more for themselves.
A lot of people would never call them homes, but they were actually there where they lived. Well, that didn't sit too well with the Indians because they kind of had the understanding that they could live there in perpetuity, you know. They had a home there for as long as they wanted, but the church saw that differently.
When the Mormons settled in the West, they had a different view of who the Indians were. They felt that they were blood cousins of the Lamanites, and that the Lamanites did have a right to exist. In many places in the West, white Americans were using philosophies defined during the Enlightenment that said that nomadic peoples, indigenous peoples, have no rights whatsoever. It's whoever can use the land to the best purpose. And therefore, white Americans were absolutely justified in killing all the buffalo and displacing all these worthless nomads. Mormons had a slightly different view, that they had an obligation to try to redeem the Lamanites and bring them into Christianity and civilization. Many other whites shared the same views, but Mormons held them as a fundamental part of their religion.
When Brigham Young led our Mormon people across the plains to the slopes of the Wasatch Range, he looked upon the desert surrounding the Great Salt Lake and cried out, "This is the place. The Lord's house has been built here. A desert has been redeemed. People of many nations have gathered here."
For Brigham Young, it was a win-win situation. If the Indians destroyed Connor and his troops, that would be a triumph for Brigham Young's policies. If the army destroyed the Indians, as they did, the Mormons could then settle Cache Valley.
Today, both the Shoshone and Mormons attempt to maintain a delicate balance. Many are one and the same, living by both traditional Native and Mormon teachings. Yet they have not forgotten the harsh treatment their ancestors received when the Mormons first arrived in Utah in the 1840s.
I'd stop and almost cry thinking about how they were treated.